Hello, hello. We are now starting with the let me try that again. GitHub Bootcamp. So we'll be going over a couple of basics. Let me just mute that. So we're going to go over a couple of things today. Primarily, we're going to go over what exactly is Git and how it relates to GitHub, because they're not the same thing. We'll be going over sort of how Git even works and how it's structured to work to get you set up with a good mental model of it. We'll also be going over just getting you installed with Git, as well as hooking up Git with your GitHub account and all that good stuff. We'll also be going through kind of different common editors and how to incorporate Git with them, primarily VS Code, PyCharm, and then Chris here will be our command line Git expert tuning in. And then after that, we'll break out into the second session. And for that, we probably won't be recording it. We'll be hosting it within the Discord channel. And that'll be where we break out into smaller groups. And we can actually practice using the commands that we're just learning, set up a repository, and all that good stuff. So let's get started. What is Git? So Git is something called a version control software. There are different types of this. Like Git is not the only one to do it. It just happens to be a very popular one. I believe another one is like SVN and other things like that. So the way that Git does it is every time you make a commit, it takes a snapshot of your code, like the full code, all the files in that commit. And then as you take different commits, there's different snapshots. So, and it'll attach like, hey, who made the changes in this snapshot? And it'll attach a history, historically called a blame. So you can do git blame and it'll tell you who made this change. So, and that way, with this history, if you need to be like, oh no, we need to remove like the change made 20 commits ago, you can, because it's a snapshot, so you can remove it. Chris, Scale, anything to add there?
You've got it all. It's a nice tool for keeping track of different things.
It's very useful if you make a monumental mistake, being able to go back in time and fix it. Not talking from experience, obviously.
Of course not, Chris. Of course not. Git rebase who? So let's talk a bit more about how Git actually does the different branches and the commits. So what happens is that when you make a commit, so these circles will be the commit. That is a snapshot of the code. So I made a commit here, and we'll just say that like I make another commit. So all of a sudden we now have two commits, and this is all in one branch. So we'll call this, let's say, the main branch. So this branch is called main. What it's doing is it's like, oh, this is the latest commit. So this is the pointer, and the pointer is called head. So that way, as you make commits, it's like, oh, this is the latest one. So as we make more commits, we add different code features. We do all of this sorts of stuff. The head ends up like moving to here, and then it's here, and it'll always track with our latest commit. So Git lets you do some pretty cool things where you can always like be like, oh no, we need to remove that commit. So like for instance, if all of a sudden these last two were the wrong thing, you can just be like, hey, Git, can you reset? And it'll be like, oh yeah, sure. Just kidding. This is the new. I'm pointing to here instead now. And it's like this stuff just never happened. So that's one of the useful things in that you can rewrite history. You can also get into pretty complex stuff where you can like cherry pick commits. You can be like, I just want to remove the middle one, but keep the other ones in between. You can do that as well. So the awesome thing about Git, which is using branches, is let's say we have a main branch. This is where we're sure about this code lives. But if we want to maybe work on a feature, we can call it like a feature branch. So the feature branch is like, okay, so this is where our last stable commit is. So let's say it is this one. So this is the one where we're like, hey, we feel pretty confident about this code. I did the wrong one there. So this is where the head is pointing, the pointer for the last commit. So we can be like, hey, we want to work on like new features, but we're not sure how these features are going to be ready yet. So we still want like critical bug fixes to get pushed to that main branch, but we still want to work on like other features. So what happens is it's like, hey, from this commit here, we're going to keep working. So it'll sort of copy that previous commit history and branch off there. So we can make like other features. We can add new commits, we can test them, but the main code will still live on main. And and then once the feature is ready, we're like, hey, okay, now we're ready. Even though main might have had a couple of other like commits and things, we can still push. So, and this is one thing, you should always pull frequently. So like if other commits happen in main, you can also pull those down to your branch. But we'll go over that in a little bit. But for now, let's just say like the main is ahead by 2 and features also ahead by 4. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. We can pull down, which is like git pull. And then you say like, hey, let's pull the changes in from that branch. So all of a sudden, these two get merged here. They get squished in. The other features are applied. And when we git merge, all of a sudden, it's back here. So now the main branch history incorporates all of this, goes back up here. So the interesting thing about the pointers is that when you switch branches, like in the command line or in VS Code or PyCharm, all it's doing is being like, hey, instead of pointing here, all it's doing is being like, hey, this isn't our most recent commit. Just kidding. It's actually this one. And it recognizes it by sort of like tagging the commits with like branches, with tags. And so it'll be like, oh, it's this branch. Okay, this is the branch, and these are the commits associated with it, because it kind of has different pointers. Chris and Scale, please interrupt and tell me where I was wrong.
No, you got it all. We've got a few questions from chat, which might help people here. First question for you is, what is head?
So head is the main pointer of Git that sort of points to the latest commit. That everything else is history, and that's the latest. If you want to make new commits, like you make it after the head, and the head just keeps moving. You can think of it like a C-style pointer, where you point to, like, this is the variable. And then in like a linked list, you add a new one. You're like, just kidding, this is the new variable. And it just sort of moves along. And you can also switch where the pointer is pointing to on different branches. And that's how you switch branches. You change what pointer you're doing. And git merge will sort of be like, okay, let's look at the different snapshots. So we need to merge these two in. It'll calculate a diff based on the snapshots, but really it just merges the two in and just takes these commits, puts it in there. If you end up having conflicts, like let's say you have two commits, one in the main branch and one in the feature branch, and they both change like the login code, you're going to have to choose which one takes priority. So maybe there was a bug fix in main, and in your feature branch, you forgot to pull it down. Now you have to resolve it, and it gets a bit messy. That's why you should always pull down changes frequently, especially during the code jam. Chris and Scale, do you want to explain the difference between merge and rebase?
Sure. Go on, Scale.
You go for it.
So a merge, my understanding of merge is it pulls the head to the latest part. So actually I can't move that here. So put me in the spot trying to figure out. So merging is like the non-destructive option, essentially. So the existing branches aren't changed in any ways. So it sort of avoids some of the pitfalls that rebasing can add. So rebasing is the alternative, which means, say now that feature versus main branch there, if you wanted to rebase feature branch onto the main branch, then that moves the entire feature branch to begin on the tip of the main branch. So you can see there those four dots on the end of the feature branch. Those would all be shifted up to the end of the main branch, rather than what we did before, which was merging in main first to get the changes from main into the feature branch. So essentially it shifts all of the features onto the end rather than keeping main in sync, I guess, maybe wait for it. So one of the major benefits of rebasing is that you can sort of get a cleaner project history. So it eliminates a lot of the needs for those merge commits. So as Kat said, when you were trying to, before with merging in, you would merge in the changes from main since when you started your branch. What that would do then is add a commit in your feature branch there. And obviously, if main is changing quite a lot and that feature branch is around for a while, that could mean there's a lot of those merge commits as you're going along. But what rebasing does then is just, you can just shove the feature branch onto the end of main. So yeah, it eliminates a lot of the unnecessary merge commits. And also as well, it makes the Git log, Git history look a lot nicer. But obviously then there's some trade-offs where rewriting history like that can be potentially very bad if you're working collaboratively with a team. So if there's public commits, if there's people working the code, rebasing quite often like that can get you into a pickle. And I've definitely had to deal with that quite a few times. So I personally prefer merge commits rather than rebasing, but there's good times to use both. And also, I guess, less importantly, rebasing sort of loses context that you get from a merge commit, where you can't see when changes from main are actually pulled into the feature branch. It was just all of a sudden appears when you merge it at the end. Think that made sense?
Yeah. I'm definitely a rebase user over merge. I tend to dislike the extraneous merge commits, and I typically work on a small set of features at a time, where I'll just sit down for half an hour, write some stuff, and like not much else happens on the repo during that 30 minutes, so I feel comfortable rebasing. But if I'm working on something lengthy that takes a couple of days, and I don't want to keep pulling down the changes and doing merge requests, or if I don't want to like rebase and just add it to the end and lose all the context, as I was developing things over several days and the repo is changing, then I would do a merge request.
Yeah, I think I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think is it Atlassian, the makers of like Bitbucket and all of that. They have quite a really good write-up on merging versus rebasing and when to use one over the other, which I definitely recommend. I wonder if I can find a link to that to paste while we're
all right, so Chris will go hunt that down.
Yeah.
The one thing to note is that Git is separate from GitHub. So far, all of this version control can happen locally. This is all within your computer. So what happens is with Git, there's sort of different stages that you sort of work on. So you have your primary, what we'll call the working directory. This is sort of like, we'll call this the WD, the working directory. These are the changes where you're like, hey, I just need to start making changes. I don't know if the changes I'm going to make are for sure yet. Like, this is me testing it. This is sort of your testing grounds. And as you code things and you're like, oh, okay, this is definitely the code that I want. I need to add in this code here. I've tested it locally. It looks good. Now I want to sort of get it ready as I work on other files. So you want to essentially stage the files. And this is where you do git add. Or if you're in VS Code, you can literally just click a button and it stages them. So this is the staging area. So this tells Git that it's like, hey, these files are like almost ready to be like committed into the history. I might need to add in a couple more files before I like make a commit, but at least this file is ready now. So if you're working on like a login system, let's say you finished the back end routing in like Flask or something, and you're like, okay, I added in the route for the login, I added in the model, you commit that file. But now you need to adjust the front end for a bit because you need to add in a forgot password. That was the feature you're working on. So you git add your back end file, and then you go work on the front end. You git add your front end file. And so both of those are sort of in the staging area. So let's say you have your views.py. I'm going to take a Django approach to this. And then you also had to adjust your template. So you'll have like your index .html. So you've git added both of these files. Now they're ready to be committed. And because you're trying to commit just atomic code, so this is something that's kind of important to keep in mind. When you make commits, they should be atomic. Sebastian, if you ever want to bother him, he's a little bit busy right now, but he has a great description of what sort of that atomicness means that I will try my best to summarize. But essentially it is you should commit only the minimum amount of code to get a feature working. So if you're doing a full login system, and you're like, okay, I need to add a feature for the user to, for like, if they forgot their password, they can do it and it'll reset it. That would be like, okay, so the first thing I need to do is add that to the front end and then make sure when people click the button, it'll actually do something on the back end. You're not going to yet like adjust like the user login or anything like that. That is out of scope for the commit. This commit is just very atomic. It's just dealing with just the forgot user aspect. As you work on the other login systems, like, okay, now we need to add a new user account, the changes associated with that would be in a different commit. You want to sort of keep it small and atomic. So if, for instance, you're like, oh, just kidding, we don't want users to be able to reset their password. If you forget it, tough luck. You can just get rid of that one commit rather than going through this one commit that changes the whole login system and be like, ah, crap, now we need to write a commit to revert this. It sort of keeps it easier, and it's easier for people to review because they can be like, what does this code do? Oh, it just adds this. Let me read through it. And so once you have the files sort of like ready, so you made the changes, you saved them, you tested them, and you're like, okay, I need to tell Git that I'm ready to make a commit. You added them, so they're in the staging area, and now you can just do a git commit. This is the actual, like, hey, Git, I'm committing these files together, and that adds it to the Git history, and now it's like a little snapshot in time. And then that is in your local repository. And so with this, you generally do like your message title, and then you also do a description. And so with that, you'll be like, hey, I'm adding in the forgot password. I'm adding this because X. On the back end, it does this because of Y. I'm making these sort of changes. And it stores these snapshots in a folder called .git. When you initialize a repository, it adds that .git folder, and that's where all of these snapshots live. Highly recommend you never touch that folder. Just leave it alone. Just let it live. And this is sort of the process as you move through. Pull requests come in later for GitHub. Pull requests are actually not a thing that exists in Git. That is purely something that GitHub has added. Talk Python with Me actually has a great interview with the creator of Git, where they sort of go through like the popularity of Git, how it was created. and some of the sort of interesting design decisions they made. And one of them is that the pull request isn't a Git thing. It usually is associated with it because GitHub has it and GitHub runs on Git, but it's actually not a thing that exists. In Git, you just have branches and you merge, branch, merge, branch. That's sort of how you do it. But this is sort of what you're talking. And for your local stuff, you're like, okay, I'm going to make changes, tell Git I'm ready, and then you stage them like you commit them to history. Anything to add, Chris and Scale?
Currently getting quite a few questions about what is Git in general. I think we covered that a bit earlier, but for the people just joining us now, if you aren't familiar with Git, Git just allows you to track your files and track your changes. So you can work in teams and you can work on different things at the same time. What Kat was explaining just now is the process of committing or taking the changes you've made to your code and saving into the Git history.
Yep. And so in terms of making a decision between like, hey, what's a branch and what's a commit, that just takes some time to sort of tease out and figure out, like looking at how existing projects do it and everything. But generally, and there's different ways to approach branches as well. For instance, and we'll get into this a little bit, but as a teaser, one of the ways is you have different branches that have different functions. Like you have your main branch, and that is like your release branch. You'll have your feature branch, any new features are added there. And then you have your bug fix branch. And all of the different people work on all of those different things. But for instance, on a small team, maybe that's just a bit overkill. People generally know who's working on what. You can then have branches that are instead like trunk branches. So I will have my own branch that I just work on various things. Like I'll have cat dash bug fix this specific bug fix. Chris might have his own because he's fixing a different separate bug. And we freely create branches and delete branches. There aren't these long-standing like feature branches. They're just created when we need them, and they're then erased, and they're sort of relating to the specific person. So those are sort of trunk branches, and that's another common way to do it. But yeah, generally the way that you do it is you git, add, commit, you make the different commits until you have like a good history. Sometimes it only takes one commit, and then you merge and then it's ready. All right, so let's actually get y'all started with installing Git. Let me paste this into the chat. So Git is a separate software. The website is called git-scm.com, and they have different download options for Mac, OS, and Linux. I believe a lot of Linux repos just come with Git out of the gate, so you can check it out. Yeah, Google Drive actually takes a similar approach to like Git. Like a Google Drive also has that sort of version history. Very similar thing to Git. Git is just sort of been around for longer, and I think Google took inspiration from Git and these other version control softwares. So you can definitely think of Git as like the Google Drive, like you look at your version history and say who made changes where. Very, very similar. All right, any other questions looking in chat? Vecco asks, when deleting a branch after it's been merged, are the commits still visible on the main branch? So when you do a merge, it copies over all those commits, and now it exists on that main branch. So if you delete that like feature branch or that other branch, that's fine. The other commits still now exist on the main branch. That's what the merge does, is it copies the commits over. So you are free. I know for Python Discord, we enable the auto delete branch after the pull request has been merged, because the branch should really just be for that one feature for our usage. And after it's merged, we're good. Delete it. So we have the auto delete enabled for us at least.
I only use Windows. Can I run into some operating system disadvantages? I only use Windows, so I haven't run into any just yet. So I think there might be minor differences, but when it comes to Git, it's fairly standard across all of the operating systems. So yeah, you shouldn't come into any issues there.
Yeah, I'm also a sole Windows user, and I haven't had any issues with it. The Git install is fairly good. And worst comes to worst, I use WSL and hop over to Linux. So, okay, so now we're going to dive into sort of the difference between Git and GitHub. So Git is intended as just a version control software. All it does is keep track of this repository. I will keep track of different versions of this code, and like it has a very narrow scope. It does this one thing really well. GitHub is like, well, typically people need to collaborate. So what if we now host that repository in the cloud? And it also, GitHub will add like additional features that Git doesn't have, like a pull request. So what happens is that you have your local computer, right? So that's your local computer. And with your local computer, this is where you do the whole, like, you have your working directory, you have your, like, committed things, you have different branches. That's still all local. All the things we were talking about before, all definitely still local to your computer. When you commit things to your repo, like that last step where you do like the git commit, now that is attached to your local repository. So what GitHub does is that, so when you install Git, you create a username and an email. That email should be the same email as your GitHub email, because that's how GitHub ties your Git account and your GitHub account together. We'll get a little bit into how to set up your SSH keys. And by we, I mean Chris will walk you through how to set up your SSH keys. But that's essentially how it do. The emails have to match. So when you have that local computer, you have your local repository there. And what happens is when you push, that now pushes it to a local, to a hosted repository. Git can accommodate pushing to anywhere. You just give it a URL to go to, and it's like, I will send changes there. And it'll send it wherever. So you don't have to use GitHub with Git. There are other options. But GitHub is obviously the most common. So when you push, it means that like, hey, take this last commit snapshot and like put it in the cloud. And in this case, it's GitHub. And the reason we are going over GitHub specifically is because it's what we require for the CodeJam. You can also apply this to other things, like GitLab has their own thing. You can also apply the same principles, but we're going to be talking about GitHub specifically. And so you have GitHub. And here you have your team's repository. So you'd be like, hey, I want to git pull, and then you can give either a URL, or you can also sort of add your own repository name, like an alias, essentially. It's how GitHub does that. Chris and Scale, do you want to go over sort of the git pull, adding repo names and managing different repositories and things?
Which part specifically?
Mainly just going over sort of the common commands like origin and how to set up that local repo, why origin is the common name, and just sort of what those commands mean.
All right. So Kat has talked about having different repositories and what GitHub is. So when you're working locally, you have your local copy of your project. That's just the code and the Git repository. What the team's repository is, or the remote repository, as Git would refer to it, is the central place where you have everybody's changes saved and where you have everything pushed, so to speak. When we're talking about remotes, the most important one you're gonna be thinking of is Origin. Origin is just the main source of your data, but you can also have a remote of any name you like. For example, you can name it Upstream, or you can but Origin and Upstream are two of the most common names you're gonna use for your remotes. So on the screen there, you see Kat has drawn us very helpful arrows. Pushes your changes from your repository on your computer to the remote, or as we just said, origin of your team's repository, or you can pull changes from your team's repository to your computer, to your local repository.
We want to go over git fetch versus pull here.
Yeah. Chris, feel free to go through it while my computer struggles to write.
Sure. So you can see that top box there is sort of the GitHub remote repository there that has that all of the Git history, all of the commits that's on the internet. You can push to it. So you can push your changes from your local commit, local Git up to the team repository. You can git pull to pull them down. What git pull does is also add those commits to your current branch. Whereas instead, git fetch just updates your local repository with the remote repository. It doesn't actually implement any of those changes straight away. So you can git fetch just to update your local copy, and then git pull to actually then implement those changes locally as well. So if you just want to, I don't know, update local repository, but you don't want to make anything change on your, say you're coding in VS Code and you're making changes, but you don't want to change any of those changes, and you just want to fetch things from the origin, you just do git fetch. Do you want me to run through SSH keys while you're doing that, Kat?
Yes, please. And we'll work on answering some of the questions that have come up with sort of pull versus fetch. One important distinction is that fetch won't actually alter like the files you have. It'll just be like, hey, I checked, there are changes. I'm not doing anything with it, but hey, by the way, there are changes. Pull is like, hey, there are changes. I've got it. You're good. So it's sort of a difference there. Usually pull is what you want. Usually. And now let's get into SSH keys in case you don't want to keep typing your password over and over and over and over again. SSH keys are sort of like the standard for how to interact with like Git and this push pulling thing.
Cool. So what I've done to help us with this is completely nuke my local site repository. So I'm going to re-download the site after setting some SSH keys. So in GitHub, let me just pull up the page to make sure it doesn't show anything that I don't want to show off. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So in GitHub here, you get your local account, you can get to this page, you click on your little avatar up here, hit the settings, and you come up to your profile. You can go to the SSH and GP keys. You can see here, you can add a new SSH key and list all the SSH keys you have here. So what you can do, this is where you want to add a new SSH key. What an SSH key is a way for GitHub to authenticate a request coming to it to say, okay, I'm going to commit these changes and push them to GitHub. An SSH key is similar to a username and password, so that Git can then say, oh yes, this is actually coming from Chris. I trust that. I'm going to save it. So what you can do is, over in your terminal, you can just type SSH -keygen. I'm pretty sure this is cross-platform. I know it comes with my Windows machine. It probably comes with Linux as well, Scale. Is that right?
And there are a lot of distributions for Linux, but you're probably going to have something on your Linux machine. I'll link something in the chat right now for how to do it on different systems.
Cool. And it's just Google how to generate an SSH key in X operating system. So what you can do is after you run that, you hit enter, it generates the keys. It's like, okay, where do you want to save it? The default's fine. I'll press enter. Sure, I'll overwrite my SSH key. And it gives the opportunity to enter a passphrase. So what this will mean is every time you want to use that SSH key, you then actually have to enter in a passphrase as well as just using the SSH key. For demonstration purposes, I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to press enter again, and that generates it. So what I can do now is just head over to, I type in cd, I go to my users file, I can do cd.ssh to go into my SSH folder. And if I list all the files here, you can see there's an ID_RSA and an ID_RSA.public or .pub. This .public is the one that's safe to share around. This ID_RSA you don't want to show anyone because this is your private key, and that's the way. If you want to read into it a bit more, you can search up how public private key works. But essentially what you want to know is don't share this file, share this one. So what you can do now is if you just type cat ID_RSA.public, you'll get this lovely file here. So what you can do is just copy all of this, go back to GitHub, give it a typo, call it Chris's PC, and paste it all in here. So you should have the SSH_RSA and your PC name at the end, and all of this random gibberish. You can hit add SSH key. You can type in your password and confirm password, and you can add that SSH key to your profile. So what I'm going to do now is head over to the Python Discord site repository. And this is where you can see your familiar GitHub repository page. What you can do then is this code button makes the commands nice and easy for you. You can see here's a few different tabs, what you can do. So this is probably what you're using at the moment. It's the HTTPS, which you have to type in your password for. Whereas if you hit this SSH key tab, this gives you the SSH equivalent. So what I can do is just copy this, head back to my terminal, and I can type git clone and paste in that command. And what this does is tells Git, okay, Git, I want to clone this repository. And because it's using that SSH link, it's going to clone it with my SSH key. But before I do that, I'm actually going to go into my source folder because I don't want to clone that into this SSH folder. I want to clone it into my projects folder, I call it. So if I just git clone this, what that'll do then, just do it all for you, no password required. And at the end of it, there will be a lovely site folder that you can open and is all ready to go and start coding. So I guess we can field some questions here. I'll keep this up. Anyone notice any questions in the answer?
I'm seeing people asking about different authentication methods. I'm seeing PyCharm and I'm seeing personal access tokens. I can talk about PyCharm real quick. PyCharm and other JetBrains IDEs in general, they have GitHub plugins which come installed by default. They can allow you to log in and use GitHub without going through the SSH process, but it's still a good thing to know anyways. Anyone want to talk about personal access tokens?
I haven't used personal access tokens too much, but my understanding of them is it's the way to interact with the GitHub API. Is that right?
Yeah. They're probably not going to be too relevant here, but you can use them in certain situations as a different method to interact with your account. But for most part, SSH here is going to be your best bet.
Mm-hmm. So SSH keys are one way of doing it. I personally don't. That's just not really a thing I do, mostly out of fear of SSHing. But the one thing that you do is, hopefully by now you've all installed Git. So you have, if you're on Windows, you have Git Bash. If you're on Linux, you probably have already had it. And if you're on Mac, I don't know. Sorry. But I'm sure that you have installed Git via the git-scm.com download and everything. So the next thing you need to do is to tell how to hook up Git and GitHub is you need to configure Git to use like whatever username you want, and also to tell Git, hey, all of these changes I'm making, you should attach them to this email. Like this email is the blame for it. So to do that, it's a command that I can hopefully type or write out right now. Give me 1 second. So you're telling, hey, Git, this is a command you type in the command line, or in Git Bash if you're on Windows. So you're telling, hey, Git, I want to configure. I want to make this global. So whenever I use Git, please use this, not just for this session. And then you're going to type in your username. So for me, it would be like cat or something. And then you type in the email or the name that you I did that wrong. Give me 1 second. You want to be like, hey, I want to set the user, specifically the name property of the user. And for me, it'll be cat. So now it's like, hey, whenever you launch Git and you make commits, it'll attach it to this user profile. And that user profile has the name of cat. And the important thing for linking it to GitHub is you do the same thing. That's what these 2 dashes means. It just means copy down what's above. That's me being lazy, not writing it out. Don't do that in terminal. Write the full thing. And I'll be like, hey, the user.email. And this is the part where you need to hook it up with GitHub. And for me, it'll be cutie-cat at pythondiscord.com. And I have a GitHub account, theoretically, that's also like, hey, cutie-cat at pythondiscord.com. And when you log into GitHub, that's what you set as your email. And when you push and pull, it'll sort of check these 2. I know when I push and pull from like either GitKraken, because I use GitKraken, or VS Code, it'll ask me to like enter in my GitHub credentials. I do that, and then it's good to go. And I have a link set up between GitHub, and I can push pull down. But generally, if you're going to be like real developer, but like actually develop like as your profession, SSH keys are the way to go. So you want to sort of dive into that and do all that good stuff. And for those who don't know, Git is purely a command line program, but other programs have been created. The git config command, this is just for Git, so it'll work for Bitbucket too. I don't know exactly how to tie Bitbucket, but I imagine it's a similar system where they sort of just tie together the email addresses and they ask you to verify both. I use GitKraken. Let me actually share my screen and show you it. Do I not have? Give me 1 second. For some reason, it's not actually seeing GitKraken. Oh, that's unfortunate. Okay. Give me 1 second while I load up GitKraken and share my screen. And there we go. So this is what GitKraken looks like if StreamYard would behave. Okay, cool. So this is essentially what GitKraken looks like. I have already opened a repository, but essentially you can sort of clone a repo, and that means, hey, I want to clone down this GitHub repository and put it down on my machine. That's what Git clone does. I can also initialize a local repo, or I can open a repo that I've already had connected. So for instance, this is the CodeJam 8 qualifier repo that you've all used to qualify for the CodeJam. You can see here that there's one branch, master. You can see here all the different commits. So I made the last one where I added in the local test suite that would check for mutating arguments. And then we recently had Zig add in an update to the README. So you can sort of see here like the different branches that have existed and when they've been merged in. It's very useful. I can also create branches, and the branches that I create will also be reflected in my VS Code as well. So usually I create the branches from here. If I need to reset, I will generally do it, and it gives you different options. So it's really this nice stuff. The default Git in VS Code doesn't have all of these features like pushing and pulling. It only has like the basic local version control. In terms of like interacting with GitHub and everything, this does it all through a graphical user interface instead of the command line. So I very much like Git Kraken in case you're more of a visual person like myself. So I would give it a check and everything else. Any other useful tools we should tell people about?
Since we're advertising that we're going to be using GitHub here, you can also use a tool that's pretty similar to Git Kraken, which is GitHub Desktop. You can download it directly from GitHub. It's another tool to visually manage your Git files. If I can just share it real quick. Here's just one of my GitHub projects. You can see different history from other files. You can view different branches. Yours probably is not going to look this messy. You're just going to have main and maybe one or two other branches. You can pull down changes, and you can make commits directly if you have changes. But probably going to cover more tools later.
Yep, so that's all up to sort of your own comfort level, things that you like to do there. I know personally I use Git Kraken instead of a Git command line because don't ask me to remember the specific commands or anything like that. I'm just going to click buttons. That works better for me. So we have about 12 minutes left for this session, and hopefully you've all sort of had things set up and you have a good understanding of just what Git is, what it does. We'll spend the last 12 minutes before we move over to session 2, which we won't be recording due to the nature of it and it being sort of breaking out into different sessions. We'll take on any questions you have.
There's quite a few people saying that they don't really know anything about GitHub, and it's a little bit daunting now. So that's sort of what our plans are for the next session, is to actually put this to practice and get you actually running some of these things, getting you set up the repository and sort of learning by doing. So we're trying to cover sort of broad topics in the first part, and we're actually going to get back into it in the second part.
Yeah, Git makes a lot more sense once you actually like run the commands and then see what happens. It's one of those things where you best learn by doing. Like reading all of this is absolutely overwhelming. I know that before Python Discord, I avoided Git like it was a terrible plague. But then trying to contribute to our local projects like Sir Lancebot, I had to use Git. And it made a lot more sense once I'm like, okay, I need to make a change to a file. I made the change. That wasn't so bad. Oh, I just need to stage the change. That's a button click. That's one command. That's the git add dot. Oh, I just need to write a commit message. I can do that. And then I press the check mark, or you do like the git commit, and then that's it. And then once all my changes are done, all my commits are made, I just make a pull request and I push it. So actually using Git when you're working at like the basics really makes a lot of sense. And it's sort of, you have like these step-by-steps. If you end up making a mess of your Git somehow, we do have tools and resources to help you with that. And of course, feel free to ask in our Tools and DevOps topical channel. We'll happily help you out with all sorts of Git messes. We are experienced practitioners of making your own Git messes, so feel free to ask. There's also a lot of great resources that we'll be sharing. For instance, I'm going to share one right now if it'll open. There's this one where, in case you do like make a mess of your Git history, there's a great sort of different ways to deal with it. Where you're like, oh no, I've made a mistake. What can I do to do it? And it sort of walks you through your different options depending on your scenario. So thank you, Londemo, for that very wonderful resource. And we'll have others we'll be sharing in the second half as well. Chris and Scale, do one of you want to walk through the basics of like initializing a repository and actually going through the make changes to a Python file and all of that?
Yeah, so I've got a demo project here we can start with. Just need to get some things ready.
So I will answer Salamander's question of what's the workflow if you use VS Code and GitHub Desktop. I use GitHub Desktop at work, not personally. And the way that I do that there is that I will use VS Code to actually make all of my local changes. I can switch branches and I can commit the changes, I can stage the changes, and all of that good stuff. When I'm actually ready to make it non-local and push it to this hosted repository, that's when I'll switch to GitHub Desktop. And I'll be like, okay, let me look at all of my commits on my branch. Let me make a pull request for the branch. Let me request the viewers. The GitHub Desktop is sort of when I'm done making the changes and ready to communicate those changes with my team through GitHub. That's sort of how I break up the two different ways.
All right. So I've created a demo project here to get us started using Git. I'm using PyCharm, but I'm just going to use Terminal here so you can follow along with this regardless of your system or your tools. The first thing you want to do when you're starting with Git is you're going to want to, if you already have a repository, you can clone it, which is another command we can go over later. But if you're just starting, you don't have a repository yet, open your folder and type Git in it and hit enter. If you can see down there, that just says it created a repository in this folder and we're ready to start using Git. So now I've created this file. It's not added to Git yet. It's not being used by Git, but it has some content, and we can tell Git, this is a file I have, and this is a file you should track. To do that, I'm just gonna type Git add, and then the name of my file. Now that file is added to Git. Git sees it, and Git is tracking it. If you want to add everything in your repository, you can type git add -A, which is going to add everything in your repository, in your current folder. Next step is, once we've got our files ready and once we want to save the changes we made, we can use git commit, which we covered a bit earlier, which just adds it adds your changes to the Git history. I'm gonna call this my first commit. If you're gonna be if you just type git commit, it's gonna open your file editor, and the file editor is gonna allow you to enter a name for your commit and the description for your commit. Now, if it can just load. Usually doesn't take this long to load, but all right, this is interesting. Oh boy, so that broke a little bit. I'm just gonna skip adding it through my code, my text editor. I'm gonna add it directly through the command line, which you can do by using the -m flag, which just takes it directly from the command line. I'm gonna call this my first commit because it's the first commit to our repository. Then make any other changes to this file. For example, I'm gonna add a print in here. we can commit this new change to our repository, our Git history, at print. And I forgot to. Whenever you make changes, you have to add your code again. Tell Git that you want this in your current commit. So I can add git add main again, and run the commit, and there we go. Now I've added a new commit. If we have a look at our Git history now, and of course there's no. If we have a look at our Git history, we should be able to see we have 2 commits here, 2 commits that we can change, and 2 commits we can push. And we should see that we have no more changes in our folder because we committed everything. Now, if we want to push it to our GitHub repository, we can use the remote command, which we talked about earlier. Remote add. You can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it origin here. I've already prepared a repository. I can push to somewhere here. Now, if I copy this, I just have to add the link, and it's good to go. Now I can push my changes to GitHub. We covered pushing earlier as well. But if I push this now, I have to give it the branch name, because if you don't give it the branch name, well, if you don't give it the branch name, it's gonna pick one. It's not gonna pick one for you. You have to give it one. If I do that, it's gonna take a second. And now I've pushed and created a new branch to our repository. If we go over to GitHub, we should be able to see it. This is our code. This is the code we've done, and this is what we were seeing in our folder. In the second section of this code jam, of the bootcamp, we're gonna talk about more tools you can use and how to use Git more efficiently. But that's the basics of getting your project started.
Yeah, it'll make a lot more sense. One thing that I do recommend you doing is, now that you have Git set up, initialize a repository. I know in either VS Code or PyCharm, you can go through and just be like, hey, this is the repository I want to initialize, and you can sort of see how it starts tracking. The best way to learn is just to do the thing. So just go ahead, see how it makes making changes, saving them, adding them to that staging area, and then committing them once it's ready. So there are a lot of good things there. Answering some questions, like from V the Champ. Are there any pros of Git Kraken over the default Git integration in VS Code? Sure, I can answer that. So I prefer Git Kraken just because of like the visualness it shows of the different like branches and things like that. So when you go back and like be like, oh, what branch am I working on? Oh, what are the new pull requests? What are other people working on? Because as people push changes to their own branches and I pull it down, it'll also show me their updates. So I can be like, oh, I'm working on updating the CodeJam 8 page. But let's say that someone on my events team is working on updating the main page on a different branch. I can sort of see where they're at in commits, and they can see where I'm at. So that is sort of the handy dandy thing there. Oh, so what is fork used for? So forking is a GitHub thing, not a Git. So forking is just used in the GitHub environment, but essentially it's saying that like, oh, that repo is really cool. I want to make my own version of it that is separate from that main repo. So for instance, if you really like our Lancebot, if you really like that Catify command and you want it for your own bot and you want to host Lancebot, you can download your own thing from ours, but you won't be able to push back to it. Only certain people can push up, staff. So instead, if you want to make like your own version of Lancebot that's like separate from ours, but you want to start that with the base, that's when you fork it. So non-staff to contribute have to make a fork and then push back with a pull request. But in case, like if this is what happened with the Pill and Pillow, the Python imaging library, Pill, was no longer maintained. And they couldn't get access to that main repository. So what they did is that Pillow forked Pill, so it has that base, but then continued maintaining it separately. So it has the same base, but now Pillow is the updated fork and sort of the main one. So forking is when you sort of want to take a repo and take it sort of as your own and do your own changes to it. Of course, you should respect the licenses of said repositories, like if it's an MIT license or GPL or other, make sure that you sort of respect the licenses and everything. So creating a new branch and then pushing to that branch. Chris, do you want to answer this one? You are muted.
Yes, I was. Yeah, so to create a new branch, you can use the command git checkout. I think VS Code and most editors these days have like a visual interface to do that. I might actually just share my screen and do that now. Let's quickly do that. Okay. So here is the site repository.
If we can increase the terminal size, if possible, before you get too into it. Thank you.
It's a little bit smaller, so I got small room to play. Okay. So terminal here, I got my site. If I do status, you can see, okay, I am up to date on main. You can see down here, this is the VS Code equivalent. So you can see if I click on this button, it shows a whole bunch of branches. So anything prepended with origin / means these are branches on the remote repository. So in GitHub itself, these are these branches. So you can see here, Steele has an asking good questions branch here, and there's a subdomains to query paths branch. So if I wanted to create a branch with VS Code, I could just type in a branch name here, and then just click create new branch. Now do it for me. If you're not using VS Code, your editor will have something similar. If you're going to do it in the command line, you can do something called git checkout, and do a branch name. And what this will do is mess up on that. Git checkout is to switch to a branch. It's to create a branch. It's git branch. Funnily enough, nice news in name. Is it dash? Someone help me out here. Is it dash M, dash A?
Dash B.
Dash B checkout.
Thank you, Joel and Spitfire.
You see here, I'm very much a user of this list here, where I can just type in my branch name. So you do git checkout dash B for branch name. What this will do then is create a branch. What I'll do then is it'll create the branch, and they will also then switch to that branch as well. So you can see here now down the bottom left, instead of saying main it was previously, it is now on that branch, and it appears in this list here. I can now make changes. Say if I wanted to go to the files and I don't know, go in doc compose and say upgrade to Postgres 13. I could then make the change, save it, hit add to stage that change, git commit then to say, I don't know, upgrade to PSQL 13. And then I have EPG things installed, so I can type in a password as well. Just ignore this, you won't have that. You git commit, and it says, okay, on this branch here, I now have this commit. And what I can do then is push. And I haven't checked this out yet. So you can see down here, I haven't actually pushed this to origin yet. So I've checked out the branch locally. I've made the branch locally, but that branch doesn't exist on GitHub yet. So I tried to git push it, but now Git is saying to me, I can't do that. That doesn't have an upstream branch. So what you can do then is click this little button here, and what that'll do is publish the changes. So I'll click this button here now. What does this? This VS Code does it for me. I can then check the output here. And you can see here what Git did is, where is it? Here. So what it does is pushed the branch to origin for me. So now that branch exists on the site repo. So if I go to GitHub over here and go to the site, you can see now if I click this button, my branch now exists on the site repository all the way up here. And GitHub tries to be really useful and says, oh, you've just pushed a new branch. Do you want to pull request it here? And you click that button straight away, and it does the pull request for you. Oh, I have just realized I'm sharing my application, not my window. That is very unfortunate. Let me quickly switch back and share my screen instead. So what I've done now is loaded up GitHub. I've gone to the site repository, and you can see here now, if I click this drop down here, I've got the list of all the branches on the site repository, and you can see this branch that I just created locally and pushed to origin. What that means now is this exists on GitHub. So say if Scalios wanted to, he could pull that down onto his Git and make changes to that branch as well. And as I said, GitHub tries to make it nice and easy for you. And it says, oh, look, you recently pushed this branch. Do you want to pull request it? You can click this branch, and it does the pull request for you. And you can see if I scroll down, it's got the change I made to upgrade to Postgres 13. It's got this commit right here with the commit message I gave. And then I can create the pull request, and then I can ask people to review it. And then if they deem it good, they can then merge that into main and have that ready for everyone.
Can you tell us a bit about the git status command?
Sure. So git status. Yeah. So it tells you if, say now if I make a change here, say this, try to upgrade to Postgres 15, this doesn't exist. I've just saved that now. If I do git status here, it tells you, okay, I'm on this branch that's conveniently called branch. It says, oh, your branch is up to date with the branch that's in GitHub. So origin/branch is the version on GitHub. So that means my branch is up to date. But then it also says here, you've got some changes here, the change you just made here. And it says, okay, you've modified this one here, but it isn't staged ready for commit. So it's telling me very useful here. I can git add the file if I want to stage it, so I can commit it, or I can git restore. And what this will do, I'll show you, git restore, and I just do .compile YAML, hit enter, and that will then undo that upgrade to a non-existent Postgres 15. And if I then added this back in and actually git added it, and then run status again, it will show here I'm still up to date. I'm still up to date with the origin, and it then says I've got some changes that are ready to be committed, and it's nicely in green saying, okay, it's in your staging area. I could then commit it with a git commit.
All right, fantastic. So we will be ending this portion of the stream, and we'll be moving over to the Python Discord server entirely to sort of break out into different groups and actually practice using these things. So feel free to join us over at Python Discord. You can go to it by going to discord.gg/Python, and you'll get an invite to our server. We'll be sure to release sort of a VOD of this live stream, as well as some of the resources we've been mentioning in sort of a helpful cheat sheet and guide. So feel free to join us there. Bye, y'all.